The history of the 37th Division in the Great War is more than just a chronicle of troop movements and artillery barrages. It is a quintessential American story of transformation. It's the narrative of how a collection of local militias, community defense forces, and factory workers from the industrial heartland of Ohio were forged into a modern instrument of war capable of breaking the Hindenburg Line. In 1917, the United States didn't possess a massive standing army ready to deploy to the fields of France. Instead, it relied on a concept as old as the Republic itself, the citizen soldier. For the state of Ohio, this tradition was robust. The Ohio National Guard wasn't merely a paper force. It was a living institution, deeply embedded in the social fabric of towns like Youngstown, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. When the call to arms came in April of 1917, these men, steelworkers, farmers, clerks, and schoolteachers, they didn't enlist as individuals in a faceless federal bureaucracy. They mobilized as communities. They went to war with their brothers, their cousins, and their high school classmates. They carried with them the specific cultural identity of the Buckeye State, an identity which would earn them the nickname the Buckeye Division. And so today, we will follow the 37th Division from the drill halls of Ohio to the muddy trenches of the Baccarat sector, through the hellish thickets of the Meuse-Argonne, and finally to the freezing waters of the Scheldt River in Belgium. We'll explore the strategic controversies that dogged their advance and highlight the individual acts of heroism that defined their service. We'll analyze the unique structure that made the 37th a cumbersome but unstoppable juggernaut on the battlefield. We'll examine the logistical nightmare of moving 28,000 men across an ocean hunted by U-boats. And we'll walk the ground with men like Lieutenant Albert Baesel, who sacrificed everything for a wounded comrade, and Private John Warman, who swam into the jaws of death to pave the way for victory. This is the story of the Buckeye Division. To understand the tactical reality of the 37th Division, we need to first understand the structural philosophy of the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917. General John J. Pershing, commanding the AEF, advocated for a division structure that was vastly different from the British or French models. The European allies, worn down by 3 years of attritional warfare, had moved towards smaller, more maneuverable divisions. Pershing, however, anticipated a war of sustained offensive operations, where American units would need to absorb heavy casualties and keep fighting without immediate relief. The result of this was the Square Division. The 37th was organized into two infantry brigades, the 73rd and 74th. Each brigade commanded two massive infantry regiments. The 73rd had the 145th and 146th Infantries. The 74th had the 147th and 148th. Supporting these giant regiments were three regiments of field artillery in the 62nd Brigade, three machine gun battalions, the 134th, 135th, and 136th, and a host of engineer, signal, and supply train units. In total, the 37th Division boasted a strength of roughly 28,000 men, double the size of a contemporary British or French division and significantly larger than the German divisions they would face on the battlefield. The logic was simple. A commander could place two regiments on the line while keeping the other two in reserve. When the lead regiments were exhausted or decimated, the square would rotate, bringing the fresh rear regiments forward to continue the attack. This gave the division immense staying power, but it also made it unwieldy on the battlefield. Maneuvering 28,000 men through the narrow, shell-pocked roads of France would prove to be a logistical nightmare that would haunt the division in places like the Argonne. The creation of the 37th Division wasn't merely an administrative reshuffling. It was a constitutional maneuver. The militia clause of the U.S. Constitution severely restricted the use of the National Guard, limiting its deployment to executing the laws of the United States, suppressing insurrections, and repelling invasions. It did not explicitly authorize the president to send state militias overseas to fight in a foreign war. To circumvent this, the federal government had to perform a legal sleight of hand. On August 5th, 1917, every member of the Ohio National Guard was drafted out of state service and simultaneously inducted into the Federal Army. In an instant, they ceased to be members of the Ohio militia and became soldiers of the United States. This distinction was subtle, but for these men, it was profound. It meant they could be deployed anywhere in the world, and it severed their legal ties to the state governor, placing them squarely under the command of the War Department. For the men in the ranks, this legal transition was marked by the loss of their historic unit identities. The Iron Guards of Youngstown, a unit with a proud history of policing the rough-and-tumble steel towns of the Mahoning Valley, were redesignated. They became Company B of the 135th Machine Gun Battalion of the 37th Division. The 5th Ohio Infantry became the 145th Infantry Regiment. While the numbers changed, the cohesion remained. The men of Company B were still the boys from Youngstown. They had drilled together in the armories of Northeast Ohio, and they would bleed together in the fields of Flanders. The division concentrated at Camp Sheridan, located just north of Montgomery, Alabama. For many of the Ohio boys, this was their first time leaving the state, let alone traveling to the Deep South. The cultural clash was immediate, but the rigorous training schedule left little time for exploring. At Sheridan, the men encountered the reality of trench warfare. They dug elaborate trench systems in the red Alabama clay, replicating the zigzag patterns used on the Western Front to limit damage from shell bursts. They drilled with the gas mask, a terrifying claustrophobic apparatus that smelled like charcoal and rubber. They learned to fire new automatic weapons, such as the French-designated Chauchat, which jammed incessantly, and the heavy, water-cooled Vickers machine guns that would become the backbone of their defensive power. It was here that Major General Charles Farnsworth took command in May of 1918. Farnsworth was a professional soldier, a West Point graduate, who understood that enthusiasm alone would not survive the machine guns and the artillery of the Hindenburg Line. He imposed strict discipline, focusing on marksmanship and the coordination between infantry and artillery, the combined arms doctrine that was slowly emerging from the bloodbath of Europe. By June of 1918, the division was deemed combat ready. They moved by train to Camp Lee, Virginia, which was the final staging ground before their great adventure. The mood was a mix of bravado and anxiety. They were the Buckeye Division, and they were going over there. The journey to France was a peril in itself. The German U-boat fleet was at the height of its effectiveness, prowling the Atlantic for American troop transports. To move the massive 37th Division, the Army utilized the USS Leviathan, a ship with an ironic history. It was formerly known as the Vaterland, and it was a German luxury liner that had been trapped in New York Harbor at the outbreak of the war. The U.S. government seized it and converted it into a transport ship. Now, life aboard the Leviathan was a study in claustrophobia. Thousands of men packed into the hold, sleeping in bunks stacked 4 or 5 high. Diaries from the voyage describe the stifling heat, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the constant gnawing fear of torpedoes. Officers conducted daily abandoned ship drills, a grim reminder of the fate that awaited them if a torpedo struck home. But a danger far greater than U-boats stalked the decks: the Spanish flu. The pandemic of 1918 was just beginning to rage, and the crowded troop ships were perfect incubators. On some transports, the flu spread with terrifying speed. Men who boarded as healthy 20-year-olds would die within days, their lungs filling with fluid, their bodies having to be committed to the deep and hasty burials at sea. The 37th Division was fortunate to escape the worst of the outbreak during the crossing, but the specter of disease would follow them throughout the war. The division landed in France in late June 1918 and moved to the Bourmont training area for final preparations. They were issued French equipment, helmets, gas masks, and the infamous Chauchat automatic rifles, and taught the grim realities of survival by French veterans who looked at these fresh-faced Americans with a mixture of pity and hope. On August 4th, 1918, the 37th was declared ready for the front lines. They were assigned to the Baccarat sector in the Vosges Mountains, relieving the 77th Division. Now, this area was known as a quiet sector. Both sides were exhausted by years of fighting, and they had settled into a tacit agreement to avoid major offensives. It was the perfect place for a green division to get its sea legs, so to speak. But quiet on the Western Front is a relative term. For the men of the 37th, the Baccarat sector was a terrifying introduction to war. They learned the routine of the trenches, to stand to at dawn and dusk, where every man manned the fire step in anticipation of an attack. The nightly patrols into no man's land to repair wire and capture prisoners, and the random, indiscriminate violence of sniper fire and artillery shells. Diaries from this period capture the psychological shift. One soldier noted, quote, "Everything was new, strange, and weird. The battered, crumbling trenches gave visible evidence of the titanic struggles." It was here they suffered their first combat casualties. It was here they experienced their first gas alarms, the clanging of gongs, sending men scrambling for their gas masks as the deadly clouds of mustard and phosgene drifted across the cratered landscape. The division held the Baccarat sector until mid-September 1918. They'd been bloodied, but they weren't yet broken. They had learned to survive. Now General Pershing needed them to attack. The quiet sector days were over. The entire American army was concentrating for a massive blow that was intended to end the war in one single massive stroke: the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive remains to this day the largest battle in the history of the U.S. Army. It was part of a grand Allied strategy coordinated by Marshal Foch to strike the German army all along the Western Front. The American objective was perhaps the most difficult: to drive north between the Meuse River on their right flank and the Argonne Forest on their left, to punch through the formidable Hindenburg Line and cut the Sedan-Mézières Railroad. This railroad was the main lateral supply artery for the German army. If it was cut, the German position in France would become untenable. The terrain, however, was a defender's dream. The Germans had held this ground for most of the war, and they had turned it into a fortress. They controlled the high ground, specifically the heights of Montfaucon, which dominated the center of the entire sector. The area was a patchwork of dense forests, rolling hills, and ravines, all pre-sighted by German artillery. The 37th Division was assigned to the 5th Corps, occupying the center of the American advance. To their left was the 91st Division, and to their right, the 79th. The 37th's mission was critical. They were to advance north, clearing the dense woods west of Montfaucon, and covering the left flank of the 79th Division, which was given the task of capturing the town and the heights of Montfaucon itself. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of September 26, 1918, the barrage lifted and the 37th Division went over the top. They immediately hit a wall of noise and steel. The woods were a tangle of barbed wire and brush so thick that units lost visual contact with one another within minutes. The Germans had laced the woods with machine gun nests, hidden in bunkers and behind fallen logs. The fog of war here was literal. Smoke and gas hung in the damp morning air, reducing visibility to near zero. Despite the chaos, the Buckeyes pushed forward with a relentless, grinding energy. They utilized grenades and bayonets to clear the machine gun nests one by one. By midday, they advanced roughly between 2 and 3 kilometers, emerging from the northern edge of the woods. They had achieved their primary objective. The woods were cleared. But as they emerged from the tree line, they realized they were in trouble. To their right, the 79th Division had stalled. The 79th was a draft division. They were less experienced and less well-trained than the National Guard units of the 37th. They faced formidable defenses on Montfaucon Hill and had been hammered by plunging fire from the heights. They had failed to take the hill on the first day, leaving their line well behind the advance of the 37th. Now this created a dangerous gap in the line. The 37th's right flank was completely exposed. German gunners on Montfaucon could look down and fire directly into the right flank of the advancing Ohio regiments. This situation led to one of the enduring controversies of the war. Post-war reports and unit histories engaged in a bitter debate over who was to blame for this. Veterans of the 37th, including division historian Ralph Cole, argued that the 37th had been held back by the failure of the 79th on their right flank, which prevented them from seizing further objectives because they had to wait for their neighbors to catch up. Now, conversely, the 79th argued that they faced the toughest terrain in the entire sector and that they received little to no support on their left. The reality, as confirmed by modern analysis, was a failure of corps-level coordination. The 37th did advance. They cleared the west half of Montfaucon's approaches and reached the outskirts of the town of Ivoiry. But the exhaustion and disorder of battle prevented it from offering assistance to the beleaguered 79th Division. The 37th was fighting for its own survival, and they were taking fire from 3 sides. For the next 3 days, the battle degenerated into a slugging match. The rain began to fall, turning the churned-up earth into a slurry of mud that swallowed boots, wheels, and men. Supply wagons could not reach the front, and so the men fought on empty stomachs, scavenging rations from the dead. The focal point of the 37th's war became the village of Ivoiry. On September 27th, the 148th Infantry Regiment launched its attack on the village. The German resistance was fanatical. Machine guns swept the open ground, cutting down wave after wave of attacking infantry. And in the midst of the fight, extraordinary acts of heroism began to emerge. Second Lieutenant Albert Baesel of Berea outside Cleveland was a junior officer in Company B. During the attack, a squad leader from his platoon was hit while attempting to silence a German machine gun nest. The corporal lay around 200 yards in front of the main American lines, and he was screaming for help amidst a storm of bullets. The area was a death trap to anyone who would go out there. To go out would be a suicide mission. Baesel, however, could not leave his man out there, and so he requested permission from his commanding officer to attempt a rescue. His captain refused. Baesel asked again. Again, he was refused. He finally asked a third time, and the captain relented. But Baesel didn't go alone. He grabbed a volunteer, and together they crawled out into the mud, inching their way forward under the grazing fire of German guns. They finally reached the wounded corporal. Baesel hoisted the man onto his shoulders and stood up to carry him back to safety. He almost made it. Just yards from the American trench, a burst of machine gun fire struck Baesel. He was killed instantly, collapsing under the weight of the man he was trying to save. For his conspicuous gallantry and self-sacrifice, Albert Baesel was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His actions exemplified the spirit of the Buckeye Division, a commitment to the man next to you regardless of the cost. By October 1st, the 37th was spent. They had suffered over 3,000 casualties in 4 days of fighting. They were relieved by the 32nd Division and pulled off the line to rest and to refit. They'd been bloodied, battered, and mauled, but they had broken the first line of the German defenses. The Buckeyes were no longer amateurs. Most divisions, after such a mauling, would be sent to a quiet sector for months to rebuild. But Allied High Command had other plans for the 37th. General Pershing received a specific request from King Albert I of Belgium. He was launching a liberation offensive in Flanders, and he requested American shock troops to spearhead the attack. Pershing selected 2 divisions, the 91st Wild West Division and the 37th. This was a unique honor. The 37th was being detached from the main American army and sent north by train to Ypres. They would fight under the direct command of the Belgian king, a monarch who had spent the entire war in the trenches with his soldiers. The terrain in Belgium was a stark contrast to the hills of the Argonne. Flanders was flat, waterlogged, and crisscrossed by canals and rivers. It was a land of mud and gray skies. The Germans here were retreating, but they were fighting a vicious rearguard action. They blew every bridge, flooded the fields, and left behind machine gun teams to slow the Allied pursuit. The 37th entered the line on October 30th near the Lys River. Their objective was to drive east, cross the Lys, and push the Germans back to the Scheldt River. On October 31st, the division launched its attack. They smashed through the German positions along the Courtrai-Ghent Railroad, forcing the enemy back to the Kreishautem Ridge. The advance was rapid, almost frantic. The men of the 37th, sensing that the war was nearing its end, pushed with a renewed energy. By November 1st, they stood on the banks of the Scheldt River. The Scheldt was the final barrier. The Germans had established the Hermann position on the eastern bank, a fortified line they were ordered to hold at all costs. The river was swollen with autumn rains, freezing cold, and swept by German machine gun fire from the opposite bank. All of the bridges had been destroyed. On the night of November 1st into 2nd, the order came: establish a bridgehead. The men of the 112th Engineer Regiment brought up pontoon boats and footbridge sections, but every time they attempted to launch them, German artillery and mortar fire smashed the boats into kindling. The infantry was trapped on the muddy western bank, and they were taking heavy casualties. They needed to know the exact location of the German machine gun nests in order to direct counter-battery fire. It was a suicide mission. But volunteers stepped forward. From the 135th Machine Gun Battalion, the unit formed from the Iron Guards of Youngstown, Private John Warman volunteered. From the 112th Engineers, Sergeant Paul Smith-Hissler stepped up. Under the cover of darkness, with the temperature near freezing, the men stripped off their heavy gear and plunged into the icy water of the Scheldt River. They swam across the river, dodging the bullets that slapped the water around them. Private Warman reached the enemy bank. He crawled through the mud, cold and exposed, until he was close enough to spot the muzzle flashes of the German guns. He memorized their positions, and then incredibly he re-entered the water and swam back to the American lines. Based on the intelligence that Warman and Smith-Hissler provided, American artillery was able to suppress the German strongpoints. With the German guns now suppressed, the engineers of the 112th accomplished a miracle. They threw rickety footbridges across the river under direct fire. The infantry of the 145th and 148th regiments poured across, balancing on swaying planks, rushing into the teeth of the German defense. By the morning of November 2nd, the 37th Division had taken the eastern bank. They had breached the Hermann Line. King Albert was astounded. He later personally thanked General Farnsworth and the men of the division for their extraordinary daring. The crossing of the Scheldt remains one of the most audacious feats of arms in the history of the U.S. Army. The 37th continued to drive east, pushing deeper into Belgium. They were preparing for another attack on November 11th when word came down the line, cease fire. At 11 a.m., the guns fell silent and the Great War was over. For the men of the Buckeye Division, the silence was deafening. They had spent months living with the constant roar of artillery, and now they stood in the quiet fields of Belgium, thousands of miles from home, survivors of a conflict that had consumed the world. The cost of their service had been staggering. In just a few months of active combat, the 37th suffered over 5,300 casualties, including 794 killed in action. These numbers represent the fathers, sons, and brothers of Ohio communities who never returned to the steel mills of Youngstown or the farms of the Scioto Valley. The division remained in Europe for several more months after the armistice, serving in occupation duty and even escorting King Albert back to Brussels in a triumphant parade. In March 1919, they finally boarded transport ships for the journey home. They were demobilized at Camp Sherman in April of 1919. The 37th Division's performance in World War I cemented its reputation as a premier fighting unit. One German intelligence report rated it among the 6 best American divisions that they faced. Its lineage continues today in the 37th Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the Ohio National Guard. The stories of men like Albert Baesel, who gave his life for a friend, and John Warman, who swam a freezing river for his country, aren't just footnotes in a history book. They represent the spirit of the citizen soldier, the ordinary man who, when called upon by his community and his country, performs extraordinary deeds. From the drilling of 1917 to the victory parades of 1919, the 37th Division proved that while they were born in Ohio, they were forged in the fires of the Great War. They lived up to their motto, inspired by their actions at the Scheldt. We'll do it. And as a Buckeye myself, I couldn't be prouder of these men. Thanks for joining me.